Welcome to The Inquiry on the BBC World Service. Each week, we bring you 4 expert witnesses answering one pressing question from the news. University graduation addresses generally have an inspiring message. Think of Apple founder Steve Jobs telling students to follow their hearts, or Harry Potter author J.K. Rowling talking about learning from failure. But when Professor Eric Hurst took to the stage at the University of Chicago last year, instead of offering inspiration, he pointed out a stark statistic. In the US, almost a quarter of lower-skilled men in their 20s did no paid work at all in 2015, a figure that's grown rapidly.
These young men without a college degree are now less likely to work than they were before, are less likely to marry than they were before, have not increased their propensity to go to school, and are more likely to live with a close relative or parent.
So if they're working less, or not at all, what are they doing? Professor Hurst had a surprising answer from his own research.
Video game playing. The average young, lower-skilled, non-employed man spends about 2 hours per day on video games, and 10% of them report 42 hours a week, a full-time job of video game playing.
Professor Hurst and his colleagues have found that young men in the US are working less and playing video games more. This is both because some jobs are becoming harder to find and less rewarding, and because video games are becoming more and more attractive. The gamers say they're happy, but Professor Hurst was worried that in the future they'd find
they did not accumulate on-the-job skills because they were idle in their 20s. Playing video games does not put food on their families' tables. The effects of changing technology on labor markets will likely have repercussions for years to come.
This research has got a lot of attention, partly because it sharpens long-standing concerns about video games, that there may be a lost generation of young men sitting in their parents' basements, frittering their lives away on mindless games, with disastrous long-term effects for them and the economy. I'm James Fletcher, and this week on The Inquiry, we're asking, are video games a waste of time?
Part 1. Shooting down stereotypes.
My first job when I finished college was at a zoo, and every day I would pass through this birdhouse, and I didn't particularly like birds, I have to be honest.
Fresh from studying English literature, Catherine Isbister had little interest in birds or video games.
And then one day there was a kiosk that showed up in the birdhouse, and I thought, I've got a little time, so I played this game. And the idea of the game was you had to try to be a red-winged blackbird for a season. And the weird thing was when I finished playing this game, I actually had a lot more empathy for birds. And I thought to myself, that is really amazing. I want to understand that better. So I ended up going back to graduate school explicitly to study, what is it about games that moves people emotionally?
Catherine Isbister is now Professor of Computational Media at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She's going to help us get a handle on the basics. What are computer games like, and who's playing them these days?
A lot of people still have in their mind that the archetypal gamer is some teenage boy in the basement shooting things. But the fact of the matter is, I think the average gamer is in their 30s, and almost as many women as men play games.
Games are now a $100 billion industry, bigger than Hollywood, and an estimated 2.2 billion people play them on everything from phones to PCs to consoles.
Everywhere there's a digital technology, there's somebody making a game to play on it.
And those games vary just as widely, from casual phone games to sprawling, immersive online worlds.
There's been a real renaissance, especially in the last 5 to 10 years in game design and development, just a broad range of different types of emotional experiences that people are creating.
But sometimes that emotional depth is obscured by some of the more controversial aspects of popular games.
One that's taken a lot of flack, right, is Grand Theft Auto. They put in content that's risque or extra violent, and I think they do it partly because they know they'll get some attention from that.
You work hard, screw over everybody that you love. Hurt, rob, kill indiscriminately, and maybe, just maybe if you're lucky, you become a 3-bit gangster.
Are there any redeeming features to a game like Grand Theft Auto?
They were one of the first to create beautiful, sweeping worlds. I can remember driving around in this car, not completing any of the violent missions, just looking at this huge world and watching the sun come up, and I thought, this is incredible.
That emotional experience of gaming is not just passively seeing and reacting.
Games, unlike other media, actually offer the person who's engaging with them consequential choice making. You can get someone to feel guilt or regret when they're playing a game because they've made choices, and if there are consequences for those choices, they feel that more deeply than they would when they, watch a movie or they read a book.
Another long-held stereotype about gaming is that it's a solitary experience, something Catherine Isbister says is no longer true.
The nice thing about games is you're taking action with other people in a world together. So it's more like sport, right? It's like you're all on the soccer field together, playing together, bonding with each other.
Our first expert witness has argued that video games aren't a waste of time any more than great books or movies are, that they can provide rich, emotionally compelling experiences. But amid all this high-minded talk, she says there's one aspect of games we shouldn't forget.
There's always a role for casual fun. It's the same in movies as it is in games, right? Sometimes you just want to read genre fiction or see an action movie, right? But other times you want to have a more complex, engaging experience that gets you thinking.
This combination of entertainment and emotional depth is a big reason why video games are more alluring than ever. But is that a good thing?
Part 2. Lost in Pixels.
Many, many years ago, when I was teaching at Stanford, my son, Adam, was a video game addict.
Our second expert witness is Philip Zimbardo. Back in the 1990s, he was a psychology professor, most famous for the so-called Stanford prisoner experiment. But his son's experiences with video games led him in a new research direction.
He would be playing hours into the night, made a lot of enemies because he was so good at the game that other kids could not get on the machine. And I actually wrote an article saying, I am concerned that this kind of gaming could have a more negative impact than positive. And I saw it in my son.
So what does he see as that negative impact of gaming?
It's time away from everything else. You're not creating anything. You're not learning anything new. You're not exercising. You're not sitting down to family dinners. You're not watching the news. You're not reading. You're not writing. So the problem is you become a consumer of video games and nothing else, and it's at the expense of being uneducated in life.
This isn't just wasting time in the present. Dr. Zimbardo says it's also a way of being which has an impact on the future. He calls it present hedonistic, which is
seeking of novelty. You get bored easily. You always want something new, something exciting. You seek sensation. You need titillation. You need excitement. You make decisions on the spur of the moment without thinking of the future consequences. So this is okay if you're a kid. Once you begin to be a young adult, it means you never plan for the future. And so if you don't plan for the future, you're not going to have a future. And video games tap into that.
So what about the emotional richness and complexity of games that our first expert witness described?
It's a game. It's not life. Playing these games does not prepare you to be a husband, a father, a voter, volunteering for social needs in your city and your community. These games do not prepare you to live in everyday social reality.
We've already heard that gaming is no longer the male-dominated world that stereotypes would suggest. But the concern that gaming is problematic, that it's a waste of time or worse, is most often focused on young men. Dr. Zimbardo has written a book called Man Disconnected and says the problem for some men is not just the allure of games, but the increasing challenges of the real world.
Many young men are being lured into video games because what it means to be a man is now in flux. Women are doing better than ever academically, so men no longer even can compete with women. The other problem is you play video games, it's so exciting, and then you go to school. And school is boring. Most teachers don't know how to use technology.
And education is tied to perhaps the biggest problem, lack of employment.
If they don't have a degree, a high school degree, certainly a college degree, then there are no available jobs for them. Then that's another reason for them to stay in the video world, the virtual reality, than in social reality. I'm not against video games. It's only two issues: excess, social isolation. And when you link those two, it leads to social destructiveness.
So are video games a waste of time? Our second expert witness suggests that despite their emotional richness, games essentially don't give back. They take people, and men in particular, away from education, away from work, away from society, and ultimately away from their own futures.
It's a major problem, and the evidence is it's getting worse and worse in Japan, in Korea, in Poland, in America, and in the UK and Australia, all the places we have studied. Societies cannot afford to lose millions and millions of young men to the video game world who could make a contribution to improving the quality of life in their community.
So is he right?
Part 3. Gaming for Good.
I remember playing Frogger until the logs moved so quickly that it was just completely uncontrollable.
Zoran Popovic is a man after my own heart, someone who cut their gaming teeth getting a frog to cross a road and a river in the classic 80s arcade game, Frogger.
and I distinctly remember being frustrated by never really seeing the end of it.
Did you get the high score?
Yeah, amongst my friends I did on that specific game, yeah.
These days, his goals are a little loftier.
Basically showing people that they can become world-class scientists through participating in a game community.
Professor Popovic runs the Center for Game Science at the University of Washington in the US. Almost 9 years ago, they developed a game called Fold-It.
Fold-It is basically trying to solve one of the greatest mysteries of life, namely, how do we know what proteins are doing?
Proteins have a three-dimensional shape which determines what the protein does, but the number of possible shapes is astronomical. Figuring out the best ones had stumped even the most powerful computers, so Professor Popovic's team turned the problem into a computer game, with echoes of one of the most popular games ever.
It's kind of like Tetris, but imagine sort of Tetris on steroids, if you will, with 3 dimensions, and you can sort of bend and move things around in all possible directions, like a spatial puzzle.
And so when you say game, I think kind of fun, and when you say protein folding, I think homework, hard work. What are the game elements that mark this out as a game that you brought to this that you thought engaged people?
There's music on, but there's also visual elements to it. When you accomplish something, there are sort of these immediate feedback, things splashing, things turning red, things spinning around.
There's a scoring system too, and social interaction with other players. About 500,000 people have now played Fold-It, and their discoveries have been used to research diseases and develop drug treatments.
There was a protein that people didn't know how to solve. They worked on it for 13 years. They say, okay, we'll present it to the Fold-It community. 10 days later, this protein structure was discovered and confirmed in the laboratory.
Professor Popovic's team have recently launched another game called Mosaic, which gets players to help figure out the shape of brain cells called neurons.
What's amazing is that it has already generated about 100 or more what I would call sort of game-based neuroscientists who have sped up the scientific process by a factor of 4.
With both Foldit and Mozak, work that was previously being done by professional scientists who'd spent years studying for PhDs is now being done by
electricians, secretaries, paralegals. You wouldn't think that they would be into science, but they're the ones that come up to the top. We really did something unique from the perspective of having people really reach expertise, world-class expertise from practically not knowing anything about the domain that they were working on initially.
Despite this steep, unorthodox learning curve, Professor Popovich says some of these people he calls game-based neuroscientists are good enough to be paid.
I see a number of different neuroscience labs in next year or two basically being able to compensate people for what they're working for. I can tell you I'm actively working towards setting up these kinds of structures now.
Foldit and Mozak are part of a burgeoning field, games which aim to make a positive impact in the wider world. There are games aiming to do everything from treating attention deficit disorder and PTSD to improving the global response to pandemics. One of the fundamental mechanisms of games is that the difficulty level is intelligently adjusted to match the skill of the player, so they don't find it too hard and give up. Zoran Popovich's team are already using this in educational games for school kids.
When you apply it to math and English, it turns out that kids don't get disillusioned. They get actually inspired by doing this, and they're believing in themselves, which is oftentimes the most important thing.
Our third expert witness has explained how some video games do make a contribution, both to society through scientific discovery and to individuals through education, possibly even allowing them to earn money from the skills they learn. But protein folding is always going to be a tiny niche, and you could argue that science games are more science than games. Could mainstream gaming ever deliver the same sorts of benefits?
Part 4. Worlds Apart Together.
I'm currently playing a game called Dark Souls it's notorious for being punishing.
If you still think that games are just frivolous fun, Tom Brock might convince you otherwise.
The tagline of the game is "You died," and basically it's a gauntlet of failure that we keep throwing ourselves against in order to try to master puzzles.
He's a sociology lecturer and gaming expert at Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK. Although he's punishing himself with puzzles, he says focusing too much on the mental challenges or emotional content of gaming ignores one of its most important elements.
If you actually look at a skilled player's hands, they're incredible. They're performing in excess of 800 actions per minute. If anyone was to want to understand the skills that are generated from playing a video game, then I would suggest that they go and YouTube professional gamers and watch the videos where people have recorded their handwork. Look at that and then keep something like a piano player in mind.
Highly skilled piano playing and gaming are both the products of obsessive, often socially isolated practice. But in the past, only one of those skills has been fated. That's beginning to change with the rise of competitive gaming, known as esports, where players vie for prizes that can be in the millions of dollars.
Now we're having conversations about putting esports on the Olympics. So it's just funny how the Protestant ethic continues. It's that only that which earns us money can be conceptualized as a good.
Like Olympic sport, it's only the very few who will ever achieve money and fame from competitive gaming. But Tom Brock believes the rise of esports might lead to gaming skills being better valued in the real world.
More and more research is coming out today that suggests that games are helping players develop skills like patience, perseverance, strategic planning, creative prowess, pro-social behaviour, like sympathy, and leadership skills because people are playing together.
Some of these skills might have more personal benefits, while others might be more applicable to the workplace. Tom Brock says that through team gaming, players learn to
inspire and mobilize their teammates towards shared goals. Video game players are good at resolving interpersonal conflicts when placed in these competitive team game situations.
But even if gaming skills could help gamers find work, one of the very reasons they're gaming more in the first place is because work is changing.
My dad was a lithographic printer operator, and that was the only job he ever had in his life. I think the average amount of jobs today that young people are projected to have is somewhere in the region of about 20 to 30 in their lifetime.
As work for some becomes more transient, Tom Brock says it provides less in terms of a stable identity and community. He argues that gaming can provide some of the same sense of value and belonging that work once did.
They can't find rewarding work in other aspects of their life, and therefore the mastery of a video game becomes an important space for them in a way that others recognise and respect them for it. And that's a very powerful motivator.
It's a different way to look at something that's currently viewed with suspicion. People, mostly young men, working less and gaming more.
That is not to create a moral panic around we are losing young men to video games. It's to recognise that video games are rewarding spaces for work and say, can we change work to reflect games? And if not, then how do we value the skills that exist within games? It's about moving beyond this binary sense of play and work. It's about moving beyond this sense that, you know, work is a productive space and gaming is an escape from that productive space.
So are video games a waste of time? We've heard the fear that games take people away from what's considered the real world of work and social interaction. But our expert witnesses have also explained how the world of gaming is in many ways just as rich. And as we've just heard, it might be time to stop viewing these two worlds as opposite and separate, and start thinking about what they could learn from each other. That's all for this edition of The Inquiry, and from me, James Fletcher. The program was produced by Benedict Garman, mixed by Nigel Appleton, and edited by Emma Rippon. Thanks for downloading it. Here on The Inquiry, we love exploring the impact of technology, so if you enjoyed this program, why not check out our other podcast episodes? Why Can't We Stop Looking at Our Phones? And How Powerful is Facebook's Algorithm? And like Steve Jobs, we've got one last thing for you, something very exciting from one of our other BBC World Service podcasts, 50 Things That Made the Modern Economy. It's something you might want to get involved in.
50 Things That Made the Modern Economy with Tim Harford.
Hello, Tim here. If you haven't yet heard our podcast, if you don't mind me saying, it's great. From the light bulb to the clock, the battery to the barcode, 50 Things That Made the Modern Economy is all about the everyday things that have shaped our lives. And I'm here because I need your help. I want to find a 51st thing. What's the one extra thing you'd like to hear about in our podcast? You can listen to the episode about market research now to find out how you can send me your suggestion. The deadline is 12 noon GMT on Friday the 8th of September. So get downloading now. Just search for 50 Things That Made the Modern Economy on your podcast app, or you can go straight to the website all about my search for the 51st thing. It's bbcworldservice.com/51 things. That's 51 as in 51. bbcworldservice.com/51 things.